Welcome. My name is Jesse Sponsholz. I'm the director of the Roots of Contemporary Issues program here at WSU. The program is oriented to teaching new students the skills, research, and critical thinking necessary for success for the rest of their time at WSU and beyond. We do this by introducing you to controversial and urgent issues facing the world today, and to learn to see how seeing them in historical and global perspective can give us tools to help us make responsible decisions. Now at WSU, the sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities all complement each other to offer us the tools to better understand the world. So in the Roots of Contemporary Issues, every semester we ask nationally recognized thinkers who aren't historians to speak from their area of expertise in ways that could help you understand how your history lessons inform other topics. In today's case, police reform, the subject that we'll be learning about this evening. Now, our speaker is going to speak for about 45 minutes or maybe just a little bit less. And then we're going to have questions after that. That means we're going to go right up till 8 p.m. As you listen, you can ask questions using the chat function in YouTube during the talk. We'll collect these questions and ask them to our speaker at the end, who will answer as many of them as time permits. For those who are seeking common reading credit, at the end of this talk, you'll find a link in the chat to enter your names and information to verify your attendance. And be sure to look out for more common reading events at commonreadings.wsu.edu. I know there's another event already next week. And now to our speaker. Dr. Luis A. Fernandez is professor and chair of the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Northern Arizona University. He earned his PhD at Arizona State University. He briefly taught at Grinnell College in Iowa and then took a permanent position at Northern Arizona University, where he's worked since 2006. Now, for more than 20 years, Professor Fernandez has studied questions about how societies regulate themselves, how they change the way they regulate themselves through police reforms, and the ways that ordinary people participate in those changes in effective and sometimes ineffective ways. His first book was titled Policing Dissent, Social Control and the Anti-Globalization Movement. It studied how police interact with broad-based political movements that function through social networks. Another of his books is Rethinking Police and Justice, which looks at varieties of alternative ways of policing and their outcomes around the world. He's the author of many other articles on topics of policing and state surveillance of citizens, government responses to popular protest, and a variety of other topics. He teaches classes in criminology in the criminology department and in Northern Arizona University Sustainable Communities program. Teaches on topics like policing and crime and ways of defining and achieving complicated goals like justice. Now, in the last year, we've been having some pretty difficult and controversial conversations in America about what police do, what they should do, and how to achieve justice and safety for all in our diverse and sometimes frustratingly divided society. It's in that context that we reached out to Professor Fernandez to share his expertise on the topic. So I'd like to welcome Professor Fernandez to give his talk titled Reimagining Police, Reform, Defund, or Abolish. Dr. Fernandez.
Thank you. Let me just make sure we have things here. You can hear me okay, right? Just making sure. And we are going to share this with you. Okay, so thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure. Big hello from Arizona. I live in Flagstaff. It's actually snowed today, so you probably think that I'm in shorts, but I actually was shoveling snow earlier. Thank you to a big thank you to Dr. Jesse Sponsholz and also to Dr. Kathleen Whelan and Karen Weatherman. Thank you very much. Also to James, who's helping us behind the scenes, and Zach, helping us make sure that this gets through. I know it's a lot of work, and I really appreciate that. So today I'm here to talk to you about reimagining police, reform, defund, or abolish. I would imagine that if you've been alive over the last year, you've heard some of these controversies around these topics, right? And there were huge arguments that were really public, after last summer that have continued to play themselves out in city councils and in policy decisions that I've been following and engaged in this year. But what I want to do today is I want to talk to you about this reimagining of police that is beginning to occur, and around these topics of reform, defund, and abolish. And I want to explain to you how they function, but I want to give you a backdrop and a context so that we can then begin to understand how to understand these concepts, right? So the element of the talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first start by setting up a problem, because I'm a very good social scientist, and as a social scientist, the first thing you have to do is you have to define your problem, what it is it that we're looking at, and that we're trying to, what issue that we're trying to solve. Then I'm going to talk about the origins of policing, particularly in the United States, very specifically in the United States, and I'll tell you kind of a little bit about them. Then I will talk about the functioning of police, and that is that we need to figure out what police are. Asking the question, what's policing? Because we tend to think that that's really obvious, but it's not. It's actually, there are many different kinds of theoretical aspects to that particular questions. And then I'll finish by defining the terms for the solution, right? And I think the terms of reform, defund, and abolish are actually attempts of trying to solve a particular kind of problem by individuals that are defining problems differently. So how you define the problem is going to determine how you end up with the kinds of solutions. So I'll explain what these terms are. So first of all, we'll start with what is the problem. So here, I want to tell you a story. And the story takes us back to the Black Lives Matter movement and the mobilizations that occur. You may or may not know that there were several waves of Black Lives Matter. There was a wave, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, and then it reemerged again this particular summer very, very, very strongly, right? After the killing of George Floyd and many other young Black, Latino young men and women by the police. These were intense mobilizations. These mobilizations, from what estimate that I saw, included, the estimate was that somewhere between 6 and 10% of Americans at some point last summer were in the streets protesting. And so that means that there were somewhere between 15 and 26 million people that protested in the United States and connected themselves to the Black Lives Matter movement. In June 6 of 2020, just on one day, there were over 500 cities that had protests and demonstrations on just one day of that particular summer. In other cities, in multiple cities, there were over 100 continuous days of protest. That means that people came out day after day for 100 days. That I've never seen that before. I know that it's occurred. I've read about it, but in my lifetime, I've never seen such a mobilization that was so strong and so prolonged. It is it's not insignificant. Right? It means that it's no hyperbole to say that perhaps this is maybe the largest mobilization in the United States, if you go by the numbers of people that were in the streets, and we know that the mobilizations focused very intensely on the police, right? That once people came to the streets, they focused really tightly on police, and that the confrontations were varied from really intense and confrontational connections of burning of buildings and cars to many nonviolent protests that occurred in many cities. And there was a continuum between all of that, but what it had in common is that it pointed the finger to the police. Right? That was the one thing that the entire summer had particularly in common, right? The police were the focus. In this particular summer, we saw calls of abolition or abolish, police abolition. These terms had, I had noticed the terms a few years before. I had found them particularly intriguing from different nonprofit organizations and different movements, and I had written a paper about it. And then it picked up this summer, the concept picked up, and it seemed to have come out of nowhere, but it had a history, and then it went national, right? Everybody was talking about it, and there was a reaction. You were either for it or you were against it, but there was a huge reaction in relation to that particular kind of concept to do that, right? But the question that I want to start with as we move on, before we move on to some of the solutions, is why were the police the focus, right? We know that there was a killing of George Foreman that triggered this. There were other killings that also continued throughout the summer that were that added. But what is it about policing that really did this? So let me start by giving you just a little bit of background. Here's a little slide that shows you some information. This shows you that this is data, and the data just says that Black people are more likely to be killed by police than white people. The left-hand side of the slide says that Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. So you see that what it means is if you are engaged in a situation and it involves a police officer and the situation becomes threatening or violent, that you are, as an African-American, 3 times more likely to be possibly end up dead than if you were a white person. The right side says that Black people are 1.3 times more likely to be unarmed compared to white people. So that just means that when there's a confrontation, a Black person is less likely to have a weapon. So what these two things show you is that while African Americans and Black people are killed at a much higher rate, they're much less likely to actually have a weapon with them when they are killed. This is a disparity that protesters and people ask, what's going on? What's happening here, right? In this slide, if you look at the right side, is what I wanted to show you, is you will see a list of cities in relation to the number of killing rates of police in their departments, right? So it says that 8 out of 100 large cities' police departments kill Black men at a higher rate than the US murder rate. So the line that you see down the middle, this particular line, if you see this particular line that's the average murder rate in the United States. And what you see is that these cities, Reno, Oklahoma City, Santa Ana, Anaheim, and so on, are killing Black people at a higher rate than the murder rate in that particular, in the average of American city. So what it's saying is that in these cities, you are more likely, if you're African-American, to be killed by a police officer than you are killed by crime rate, or what happens with the rate of killings that are murders that are happening based on crime itself. So that it suggests that in these cities, police are actually more dangerous than the crime rate for particular kinds of populations, specifically Black people. This is a slide that it tries to map the relationship between police killing rates, which are in red, little red boxes here. That's the police killing rate per city. Here are 50 cities going from Oklahoma, Phoenix, Tulsa. And if you look over here, it shows that the killing rate is really high in Oklahoma and Phoenix and Tulsa. And on the other side, you have New York and other cities, but the killing rate is much lower. And the blue crosses show you the crime rate in those particular cities. And what this slide is showing you is that the relationship between violent crime rates and police killing is spurious, meaning that violent crime rates are not the cause, or not a likely cause of police killing rates. Because if it were, these blue lines, blue X's would match up with the red X's. But what we see is this relationship where there's almost no relationship between the red line and the blue line. So this is a way of saying it doesn't seem that the killings that are occurring in police departments, the ones that kill at the highest rates, are caused by crime. For example, here, Phoenix, where I'm very close, you see that the crime rate is here, but the killing rate is way up here. So this gap seems to be unexplained because this is not causing this killing. Or if you go to the New York one, it's the same way. Here's the killing is lower and the crime rate is a little higher. So therefore the crime rate is not causing, is not the causal relationship for the killing. So if that's the case, then what's happening? What do we have here? What's going on? So let me add one more final one. This slide shows you that if you look at police in terms of when police officers kill, whether they're held accountable or not, right? So out of 100 individuals, you will only have one person, officer convicted out of 100 kills, right? So at 100 killings, one officer will be actually convicted, and only 4 will be charged. So you have 4 charged, and out of those 4, 1 convicted. So that's the rate of 1%, right? 1 out of 100. So what that tells you is that or at least some people suggest, is that there's little accountability, that when police officers kill or engage in a particular situation that ends up with somebody dead, that rarely are they held guilty for what they for what occurred there. And it could be 2 things. One of them is that it could be that it's because in every circumstances they are innocent. Maybe, I don't know. This chart does not tell you anything about that. It just says that there's a disparity, right? Because in relation to activity, you would expect more individuals to maybe be negligent, and then some of them maybe be convicted, but there's not. So at least the perception for people is that there's very little accountability. So what do we have here? We have high rates of killing of Black people and Indigenous and Latino people. Indigenous usually are at a much higher rate, by the way, but they're lower numbers. You have them not mostly, but they're usually, not usually, again, they are less likely to be armed. We have ideas that the crime rate does not necessarily explain the number of shootings. So the violent crime is not causing numbers of shootings. And we have a situation where the police look like they may not be being held accountable. You put all that together and you put a summer where you have a pandemic, people are stuck at home and there's a killing, and you have a powder keg and it went off. And that's what we saw last summer, right? So how do we understand these disparities? What's causing them, right? What is happening with these? Well, what I want to do is, as we talk about this, I want to start by talking about the origins of policing. So that is that if we want to talk about policing, we need to ask the question of what is policing? What is it? Some people might say policing is about maintaining order, peacekeeping, making sure that crime is down, their safety, security. These words are always kind of thrown around policing, and that is the hegemonic notion of how we understand policing. But those concepts, I think, often don't help us. They actually obscure our understanding of the function of policing, of what policing is. So what I want to do is I want to talk to you about the origins of policing in the United States, and then draw some conclusions about what that might tell us about what the function of policing is, right? And I'm going to talk about 3. So I'm going to talk about the Southern origins, because police kind of arose in the United States almost in 3 different locations with 3 different situations. And the first one's in the southern area with the plantation and slavery. And I'll talk about that in a second. The second is the northern with urbanizations and with factories, the second level of the origin of policing. And then the third one is in the Southwest or Southwestern, and this is over the policing of colonial territory. And you have different kinds of policing that kind of arise, and you'll see that they're, so they arise. And let me tell you a little bit about them, right? The first one is the policing of the plantation. If we think of policing, as that not necessarily, if we think of policing as kind of an institution or a grouping or a societal function that allows for the regulation of space and people, then we begin to understand how it might occur and where it begins to originate from, right? In the South, it is generally known in the literature that some of the proto-policing starts with something called the slave patrols. And the slave patrols, here you see a depiction of it, an engraving from, I forget what year this is, but this is a while back, an engraving of local individuals that would patrol a southern area to make sure that slaves were not traveling between locations. And that is to say that slaves were not allowed to move from one plantation to another. They, of course, were not allowed to have weapons. They were not allowed to, learn to read, but particularly movement was key. And that is that the individuals, if they were going to move, slave individual, would then have to have a writing pass that said, here is, I'm so-and-so, this is my slave, they're allowed to move on this date from this time from this. And if the slave patrol stopped them, they would give them these particular kinds of papers, right? This is the proto-origin of identification papers that you have in these particular moments. So what you have, and the reason for this is because the South had huge numbers of slaves. In terms of numbers, they outnumbered the white individuals. And that means that if slaves organized themselves, they could overthrow the system in particular ways. So the way to prevent that and the way to maintain the plantation system of farming cotton and other crops, eventually mostly cotton, but crops, was to make sure that these slaves did not revolt. So you have to create laws that allow them to keep them in place. And then you have ways to individuals that have to maintain that social order. So if you were a slave and you got stopped, you have to give your papers and you have to do that, right? So you have the slave patrols had the right to visit every plantation and had right to search all Negro houses for offensive weapons and ammunition. So that was not allowed to have any of that because that could be a revolt. You were allowed to have corporal punishment. So if you caught somebody and they weren't supposed to be there, they could just strap them to any tree and, of course, do corporal punishment and punish that particular individual. And this is, like I mentioned, America's first modern style policing force. Eventually, I'm going to skip through a lot of history, but eventually these forces become organized around cities, and eventually the cities, they get from private to public, and they become incorporated into systems with, I believe, I can't remember the city that had the first policing force, but this is the origin in the South, right? In the North, you have a little slightly different situation. And that is, you have the notion of the night watchman and the constable. This is a kind of policing that also arises in Europe. So Europe and the United States kind of have a similar situation coming through here. So you have a person, and what do you have? You have an urban setting. The people are living a little bit closer. It is not a system of plantation, but a system of agriculture, and eventually becomes a system of factory production, right? And people are moving from the rural area into the city, and as they're doing that, that means that we need to keep the the streets safe. So from people, so you have the night watchman that's walking around and engaging and making sure that nobody is getting mugged or killed or hurt. Right? You have, like I said, we have organizational cities. These folks watch the streets at night, and by 1658, New Amsterdam, which of course becomes New York, appoints 8 paid watchmen to replace the volunteers. So the volunteers become institutionalized in New York as early as 1658. Eventually, from that process, you begin to see larger and larger groupings of city-paid individuals to keep the social order. And eventually, these individuals become the people that begin to regulate the system and help regulate and establish the social order that allows for factories to arise. And when there's tensions between factories and laborers, they become, they break strikes, and they actually are again engaged in a process of allowing for the for the workers to keep working under particularly very specific conditions. So that is that, and we see the emergence of policing in street behavior, particularly in the North. In the Southwest, we have an entirely different situation, right? In the South, we have North, Southwest, where I am right now, you have policing of colonial territories. You have individuals that are engaged in a different kinds of social order and a different kind of system. And that is a colonial system where you have indigenous people inland, and you need to displace them, you need to move them, or you need to make sure that as the territory expands and land is taken, that there's no revolt coming back, right? So that you, and in this sense is when the Texas Rangers, the concept of the Texas Rangers arises relatively early. Texas Rangers are established in 1835, a little later than the Night's Watchmen. And these are individuals that are loosely band of irregularly hired to protect the interests of newly arrived white colonists, right? So early on, they are being hired by individuals to say, I have this land. If Mexican people or indigenous people come into it, can you please help us protect this, because we need to keep our land, right? So they act as vigilantes for whites in disputes with Spanish and Mexican population, and of course indigenous population. And the main work is to hunt down native populations accused of attacking white settlers, right? So this is a long way of saying here is a different kind of system, social order, where the system is regulating, is creating a particular kind of social relations around land and land displacement and accumulation of land. And you have the Texas Rangers, that you can think of sheriffs and I think marshals as well, come into this, begin to develop as the social regulation, the legal regulation and state regulation of that particular kind of system, right? So that particular kind of system. So we have those three things. So given those three, what do we know? What can we say about what does this tell us about this idea of the function of police? Well, here's what I'm going to argue. I'm going to argue first is that we need to think of the police as an institution that is embedded within very specific social relations in very specific historical contexts. That is what they are. So a lot of the times there's always arguments about, well, the police they're all bad, they're psychologically bad, or they're all particularly good. I find those not particularly interesting, because I think there's plenty of great cops. There are probably plenty of bad cops. But what interests me is the police in relation to that. Any historical period, at any historical period, there are rulers and regulations that help create a specific social interaction, and the police help create the social interaction, right? The function of police, then, this is the big one here, the function of police is to maintain the social order of a particular historical period, regardless of how just or unjust it is. That is, police maintain the social order, and regardless of what that social order is, it doesn't matter to the police or the institution. So it could be a fair social order, or it could be an unfair social order. It doesn't. So, for example, under slavery, what do? You maintain this. You help maintain the slave system. Under urban settings in relation to factories and worker, you help maintain that particular social system. And in the Southwest, you help maintain the social system that relates to land and the displacement of indigenous people and the colonization of land. That the police are not necessarily moral or amoral, they are just created in such a way that they reinforce and help build and maintain and recreate and reproduce the social system. With that, let me define some terms, because now we have a context and we have some issues. So I want to define the terms, and I'm going to get a little bit off this and just talk it off the presentation and actually talk to you about these particular three terms, and then we can open it up for discussion and some questions if that's okay. So what I want to do is, if we're right that the police is an institution that helps regulate particular social orders under specific historical circumstances, and it's neither moral nor immoral, but rather just a societal tool of maintaining and reproducing the social order, then we are going to, and right now they are engaged in producing and reproducing a particular specific kind of social order, then how do we go about the undoing of that so that the police can then address the issue of the killing of the young Black men, women of Indigenous, Black, and Latino backgrounds particularly, right? Well, what I want to do is I'm going to define 3 solutions that people have come up with. One is reform, one is defund, and the other one's abolish. And I'm going to set them against each other so that we can help them understand these particular kinds of approaches to a possible solution, right? Reform. Well, when we're talking about reform, we can think what I've noticed is that individuals that reform, police reform and criminal justice reform has a long history. I think when I was a grad student and was being trained, this is 15 to 20 years ago, I was already reading about critiques of the fact that the criminal justice system seems to be in a continual reform and has been in a continual reform ever since its origins, and that there are individuals that engage in reform and reform practices just continually, right? So if we're talking about the issue of policing and reform, the argument or the problem, the way individuals that talk about reform, they say, okay, so we have these killings, that's the problem. We have disparities, that's a problem. This is an important issue and we have to deal with it. But the issue, it's not structural systemic, it's individual. The issue is that there are bad apples. You might have heard this argument, bad apples and good apples. And we need to take out the bad apples and leave the good apples in. So you notice that reform often, not always, but often focuses on at the individual level, individual police officers. This person might be bad, this person might be good. It's definitely not purely as an institution. And if the problem is defined at the individual level, there's a problem. At the individual level, you have a bad apple, then you have to remove the apple. How do you remove the bad apple? Well, what you do is you hold people accountable, maybe. You develop new policies of maybe engaging in higher different kinds of policies on how you use violence. So say, okay, a police officer cannot pull out a gun unless these things occur. Our rules are too loose, so we need to tighten those particular rules. Or maybe what we need to do is we need to hire more Latino and Black officers, and we're going to diversify the police department. And as we diversify the police department, that will create better relations with the community. And as we create better relations with the community, we will have a lower tensions, and therefore things will be better, right? Or you develop community policing. You're going to get an aspect of the police department that is going to engage with the community and be really good and have good relations, and again, improve the relations in the community. Part of the issue with reform is that it's been around for a really long time. And a lot of things have been tried and engaged. So when we move to the issue of defund, so if we move from reform, so again, to cap, reform says there's some bad apples, there's some issues, of course we can deal with them, let's do more training, let's put cameras, let's rechange the policies, let's engage in these things, and we will change this particular problem and reduce the number of killings, right? To make their argument the best, say, we've already been reforming for a long time, we're much better than we were, and we think we can just take it the next step if we just keep reforming in these particular kinds of ways. That's their argument. The defund people come in and say, well, I think, I don't know, I'm not sure if I don't know about that. The defund argument, I first spotted it maybe 5 years ago and noticed it as a really interesting claim coming from social movements and nonprofit organizations that were talking about defunding, disarming, and disbanding the police. That was their terminology, not mine. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. And the defund term really originates with BLM movement. It originates with the first wave, and then it really picks up all strongly again in the second wave, coming from community organizations. This argument is critical of the reform because it says, you know what, you have the police, you see their function, they're functioning in such a way that they're regulating and they're killing, but it's not about bad apples. It's about institutions. The institution seems to be a bit of a problem itself, and it's reinforcing a particular kind of society and a particular kind of inequality, and that is just manifesting itself in the policing. So what we need to do is instead of reforming the police, we need to shrink the police. So this means their economic budgets, make them smaller, other budgets, or make their scope tighter. So the police over the last 30 years have engaged with different populations that they didn't used to, as we saw the decline in mental health services, in domestic violence services, and a lot of different kinds of services. The police then became the first responders, the first connection to these particular populations. So the argument goes, we need to now reduce the scope of police so that the police maybe just engage with different populations and reduce where they engage so that they're maybe not engaging with unsheltered people, and instead maybe not be related to that at all. And what we do is we move the money from this pot to people that are trained to deal with mental illness, to deal with issues, the issues you need when you don't have a place to live. And those individuals then will pick up and take that. So you defund the police in those ways. The best argument that I've heard in this area is an argument by Alex Vitale, and he wrote a book called End of Policing. I highly recommend it. It's very good. And what he says in that book and other writings, he says that the best argument, he says, is that if you see what happens in Minneapolis in the first Black Lives Matter wave, and you see that it's triggered, Minneapolis is triggered, that's what triggers a mobilization back, I forget, it's 2011, I don't remember the dates right now, but it says, and afterwards the Obama administration engaged in a series of reforms. And here's what they did to the police after there were protests and after there were numbers of killings of young people. It said, here's what Obama suggested in the administration. Minneapolis police implemented training on implicit bias, mindfulness, de-escalation of violence, and crisis intervention. They trained police officers and they diversified the department in leadership, hiring more African-American, Latino, and other individuals. They created tighter use of force standards. They adopted body cameras. They initiated a series of police community dialogues, and they embedded early warning systems to identify problem officers. They did all that, one of the most extensive reforms in a police department. And they did that, and where is it triggered again with George Floyd is in Minneapolis. So the argument says those reforms didn't seem to at least not stop at the level that we need to stop this. So what this position would say is, the reforms are failing. We need to engage in these kinds of things, not about training, it's about social order, it's about the function of police, and we need to shrink the police, right? The last one is a little bit more intense, a little bit more radical, and this is the notion of abolish. This position, I don't know how familiar you are, but the notion of abolition is an American concept, in my view. It comes out of, not my view, many views, it comes out of the abolishing of slavery, the slavery abolitionist movement that takes place in the early 1800s and eventually has a series of moves that leads to the Civil War and the abolishing of slavery. So the word abolishing is deeply connected to Black struggles and slave struggles historically in the United States. And here the idea is is further than the defund, right? So the idea here is taking everything I said and we take it and we make it stronger. So if police are about the maintenance of social order, that is, they will maintain the social order of slavery, they will maintain the social order of segregation, they will maintain the social order of colonial territoriality, displacement. They will maintain the order of factory worker exploitation, and that is the function of police, not because they're bad people, because that's what police engage. They engage in the means of social order, and often we have to move from one social order to the next social order to make life, as we progress, to make life more just. We have to change, and one of the things that prevents that change, according to this view, is the institution of the police. The police as an institution is often what prevents movement forward. Notice that this is a different kind of take of looking at the police as that which secures safety, security. It actually views police as that which secures, which makes things secure and safer for parts of the population, but for other parts of the population actually creates terror. So from this position, and please don't confuse this position with my position, I'm just explaining the position, is that from this position, you would argue that the elimination, there's nothing short of the elimination of the entire institution of policing. Anything short of that will come short of justice in our society, and that therefore we need to eliminate it. Now, this opens up a whole bunch of theoretical questions that I think are very interesting. And I've been kind of reading in my classes and in my graduate courses and kind of debating with people. And that is, well, if police don't maintain the social order, what else would maintain the social order? Would the social order collapse? What would happen if the force that maintains the social order, this particular social order, disappears? And there's a long, long conversation to be had there in relation to how that might look, that we can have if you want to. But the position is that to abolish the police is to abolish the system that maintains an unequal social order. The inequality here is an income inequality, a racial inequality, a gender inequality, a sexual inequality, and that police become the front line in the changing of that particular kind of social system, right? So therefore, disband the police, abolish the police, eliminate it, as that being the claim. And in terms of how to do it, I'm not quite sure, but the idea is make that claim, change that, and the rest will follow, as it were. So those were the three kinds of reform, defund, and abolish, right? To conclude, I just want to say, I think I'm within time, pretty close. To conclude, I just want to say that everything that I'm talking to you is really exciting to me because it's unfolding, it's changing, and it's changing quickly. So this is something that I've been thinking for a long time, and ideas, but even in the last few months, things have shifted already, and I've started to shift my even focus in my own research, because I've started to ask the question, okay, so this occurred, these claims occurred, how did these claims begin to get implemented in real life policies in different cities? And I'm beginning to, with some grad students that are helping, that are great students, I'm beginning to track what different cities are doing in relation to these responses. And we know that there are multiple cities, Seattle, LA, San Francisco, Austin is one of the leading ones, New York, I'm probably missing a few. These are some of the big ones, are engaging in the defunding aspect already. Minneapolis, at one point, the Minneapolis City Council voted to disband the police. But then they reconstituted it again. So I'm not quite sure what happened there in terms of that. Austin defunded the police by 150 million, Los Angeles by 120, New York by 1 billion. I think these have increased. If there are shortfalls in city budgets, which I can't quite tell if there will be into the coming years. I think there will be because of COVID. Then that means that the idea that cities might have to shrink in terms of their services may mean that these strains in relation to where to cut are going to continue. And if they continue, then that means the struggle, the arguments, the debates around what to do with policing, whether we touch it, whether we don't, we change it, whatever it is, are going to continue. So my guess is, and this is, I've actually staked a little bit of my work on it, is that we're going to be in these debates for at least a couple of years, engaging in what it is. And I am interested in seeing how they unfold when it's all done, or how it transform. So the exciting part is we're in it, it's happening, it's unfolding, and it's not clear yet where it will end up. So those are my concluding remarks. With that, maybe we can talk. And I will stop sharing that. Jess is back.
I am. Luis, thank you very much. That's so interesting. I start to think about when societies start to ask questions that a previous generation hadn't asked, that it opens up all different kind of implications. And you're sort of walking us through the implications for this. And I'm thinking about especially the young college students who are watching this video, and the ways in which they might be able to participate in asking new questions and coming up with new solutions as well. And that's it's exciting to think about new solutions that tomorrow's generation might be able to come up with.
You know what?
Go ahead.
You know what's really interesting? I mean, just to get a direct thing to that, for if people are interested in this, just go to your local city council and start asking, because my guess is that these debates are happening everywhere. And some places are further ahead than others. I'm in Arizona, which we tend to think of a much more conservative state, but these debates are happening here and they're being taken very seriously. I imagine that in Washington, I know that in Seattle and places like that, they're way ahead, but I imagine that it's throughout Washington, they're having these conversations.
I have a number of students queued up who have asked questions for you. I want to ask their questions. I have one question that's kind of personal to myself. I grew up with, my father was a police officer, and he was not only a police officer, he was on the SWAT team. We had a different name in the town that I grew up, but he was on the SWAT team, and he was also undercover vice. So we worked drugs and prostitution cases. And one of the things that I saw in our household was he had a lot of really advanced weaponry. And my question is, we learned, we were very careful what we learned, and I'm not going to talk about his perspective on this, but I'm interested in the question about changes in technology, and have changes in technology played a key role over generations in the changes in how people see police and how people experience policing?
Huge. That would be another 45 minutes if I track that history of where it develops. The short version, I won't even give you maybe the short version. One thing is to watch is that Dr. Peter Kraska has written a lot about this, and he's got really good books. And he was recently, I'm not sure if he was interviewed, but at least he was doing some background work for, what is that HBO show with the British guy? Oh my goodness, what is his name? You won't know either, Jesse, because you don't watch this. But there's a HBO show that does it's called Last Week Tonight, I think is what it's called. And there's a whole segment that you can probably find on YouTube that gives you the entire history of that. And the short version is that it starts really after the riots of the late 60s. And there's an influx of Vietnam equipment that falls into the police. And then from that point on, it just kind of continues throughout. And that's one of the defunding aspects, an attempt to actually disrupt that flow of military equipment to police.
Okay, great. There are tech people who are telling us that the name is John Oliver for our audience.
John, thank you very much.
Catherine has a question, and she was interested in you gave a series of slides with statistics about policing. She asked you whether you could share the source of your evidence.
Yes, it is, I believe it's the New York Times. Where is it? Give me a second. I can put it on the side. I don't know if people can see that, but you can maybe at least put that to people.
Yeah, I think we can make that available on the YouTube.
Yeah,
great, thanks. There's another question about the BLM movement. You mentioned that it was one of the largest mobilizations that our country has ever seen. There's one question that one questioner asks about how big an impact you think the COVID pandemic played contribute to that number relative to concerns about policing, for instance.
Yeah, that's really hard to this. I haven't seen any research on that or know. I can only talk about, like a total off the cuff guess. My guess is that it had a huge impact. I wouldn't say that COVID cause that. But my guess is that if you're in certain cities where it's really hot, you're particularly working class, the heat is rising, and people are upset because they're killing young people, that are part of your community. It makes it a little easier to leave the house and engage in that. At the same time, I'm not sure that that fully explains the intensity nor the fully aspects afterwards. But so here's an academic answer for you. There's no way to ignore it. It's difficult to quantify exactly how much it had.
Yeah, that seems good. Okay. Bryson also has a question about movements around police brutality. He asked whether or not the BLM movement was the first movement against police brutality that we have seen, or have there been other movements around challenging police brutality in America?
It's long. That's not even close to the first one. I mean, you can think of, just to give it, I mean, the Black Panthers were directly related to policing of inner cities, right? Their carrying of guns was, this is, I forget the dates, I'm gonna screw them up. I'm bad with dates. I know that it's in the 60s, and somewhere between probably 65 and 72, so somewhere around there. But their carrying of guns, which has made them wearing black things and carrying guns, their whole justification was to defend themselves against police. So they said, I have the right to carry guns, and therefore if you come after me, I will shoot you because you're shooting us in the street, so we have a right to defend ourselves. By the way, it was the first anti-gun laws that were put in the books. Some of the first ones were put right after that, right after the Black Panthers. California passed a whole bunch of regulations saying you can't be carrying certain guns outside. Sorry, that's a side note. But no, that, and it can go back. You can actually maybe suggest that some of the civil rights engagement, where they actually engage in the police very intentionally and to in certain way antagonize the situation so that the police would actually beat up protesters, was an intentional way of making violence of the system visualize the violence. So that's just going back to the 50s. But I'm sure that there's more if we dig there. I'm sure that this goes further back.
Yeah, I think we can leave that to the historians. I can give you a long lecture myself, Bryson, on that topic, but I'll move on to other questions. I also had a question about the sort of geography. You gave a list of those cities and where sort of rates of police killings of Black people are higher and where they're much lower. And I noticed that Oklahoma City and Tulsa and Phoenix were in the very high, and on the far right, New York City was very low. And I was wondering about geography. Is there are there geographical bubbles where this is a particular problem, or to what degree does that help us understand that
no, the answer is no, that there's not. The New York one, I mean, we have to be thoughtful, even though we're looking at rates, right? So we're looking at ratios. We should be thoughtful that New York is so big that they can kill a lot of people before it actually marks as a high thing. So there might be an issue that in that line, there might be an issue in relation to the population. So there might be a population size effect that even though we're looking at ratios, so we're not just looking at numbers, those were ratios. But in terms of how that goes, it's not. I think from what I've seen, the data is pointing not to the fact that there's pockets or logics, but to the opposite, that there's not. That in other words, that it looks some places engage in this and some other places don't, and that there doesn't seem to be policies or regulations that actually explain that, or at least that's what I've seen. And I know it's like disturbing to say we don't know what that pattern is, but that's what it looks like, that it's unclear where, because that list, it looks almost random.
Okay, great. I have another question from Jessica. Jessica is asking if there's any evidence that racial bias is taught, intentionally or not, in police training programs or training materials.
Yeah, I mean, there is some research that suggests that Well, it's kind of hard because there's some research that suggests that racial bias is real and that it exists and that we have it. Regardless, as a Latino, I will have racial bias against Latinos, so we can internalize certain kinds of things, right? So that is it. It's not like white people have it and not. It's like it's across the. There are these kind of systems of thought that we have, and we do that. So that part is clear. Psychologists have shown that that occurs. What's not clear is that racial bias is what leads to killing, right? So that link is what's not fully understood. It's assumed that if somehow I have less racial bias, I will shoot people at a different rate. But it turns out that if you look at the shootings, Black officers don't necessarily shoot people at a different rate than white officers. So that it's not necessarily a learned behavior, or that it's. This is why the argument that I was trying to make is that it may be systemic. It is structural. And here's the kind of sociologist in me coming and saying, we can focus on the psychological aspect, we can focus on the training, but we've done a lot of that and it has not eliminated it. That's not to say that it hasn't reduced it. I think it would be wrong to say that it hasn't reduced it, but it hasn't eliminated it. So my take is that there are other things occurring. And that's the argument that I was trying to make, that I think it's the function and that we need to look at the structural arrangements rather than the psychological makeup of the police. One of the things that I teach when I teach this, the data shows that when you look at people that are going to policing, they are no different than any population. They look like a random selection of the regular population. So that throws out the notion that authoritarian people go to the thing or that, it's like, it's not true. People going to policing because they want to do good work. And then once they engage in the policing, a sense of practices begin to take place and all sorts of things begin to occur.
Interesting. Well, one last question before we let you go, Dr. Fernandez. We are here in Eastern Washington, and many of our students come from Eastern Washington or from areas on the west side of the Cascades. You had talked about the legacies of three different kinds of policing in the U.S. South, the Southwest, and the North. Where would Washington fit in the origins of policing, and what are the inheritances of policing that we have as residents of Washington?
Yeah. It's funny because as I was putting it together, I was like, I wonder, I was thinking about this question, and my answer in my head was like, I don't know. I would have to actually look into it in a little bit more. The Northwest, I'm from California, so, and having just moved from, I grew up in California, then I moved to Arizona, well, Iowa, and then Arizona. And then I spent a lot of time here, and it took me a long time to really understand that the Southwest, and that means Arizona inward, is entirely different than California. Even though California has a Western, I have a feeling that California, Oregon, and Washington, and those particular things have a different history that probably revolves around racial makeups that look different in the Southwest, where you have more indigenous people in higher numbers, and Mexican and detentions. That in your area, you very likely probably played a much bigger role in relation to the anti-Asian stuff that occurred, particularly after the building of the railroads and the movement of them, even though they actually ended up in the coast, and Asians ended up, Chinese particularly. So my guess is just a guess, is that if we look there, the racial formation that occurred around those areas they're going to have a much closer interaction with an Asian issue in a different, but I don't know enough because I haven't spent time there or read.
Next time we invite you to WSU, we'll expect you to have as part of your presentation. Dr. Fernandez, we want to thank you so much for coming to WSU, even if only virtually, sharing some of your thoughts and perspectives on different kinds of solutions to problems that our society's been thinking about. We really appreciate you joining us and sharing your ideas.
Thank you for having me, and I really wish I could have done this in person because I would have talked this for a couple of days with you all. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot.